And welcome to Inside Story. I'm Shihab Ratansi. Terrorism. It's a word that's dominated public discourse over the last decade. Its rhetorical power stems from its ambiguity, and governments around the world are quick to reach for the term for political gain. Now, a U.S. court ruling goes to the heart of what constitutes a potential terrorist threat and how we deal with it. Last week, a U.S. judge ruled that mass surveillance of Muslims by the New York City Police Department, or NYPD, is legal. Police have been spying on entire communities in mosques, restaurants and schools in New Jersey since 2002. The ruling seems to imply that religious belief alone is the basis for extra scrutiny by law enforcement, and that the state is justified in pursuing blanket surveillance of a community to preempt what it calls terrorist activities, even without any evidence of potential wrongdoing. So, a great deal to discuss. Let's bring in our guests. We have William Potter in D.C., an award-winning journalist and author of Green is the New Red, an insider's account of a social movement under siege. In Chicago, Laura Beth Nielsen, a research professor at the American Bar Foundation and director of the Legal Studies program at Northwestern University. And in London, we're joined by Shiraz Maher, a fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. He's currently leading a research team looking at the flow of foreign fighters into Syria. Professor Nielsen, first of all, then, am I wrong to think that the implication of that court ruling last week is that being a Muslim in America constitutes probable cause for surveillance, no right to privacy, and a stripping of constitutional rights because there's a chance, in the judge's words, of budding terrorist conspiracies?
No, you're not wrong. I think that this is an example of the power of the term terrorism, that when it's used, people are willing to give up all kinds of constitutional rights and protections for themselves and for their neighbors, because it's a frightening concept, the idea that there could be a secret group of people planning to kill innocent civilians for political gain. It's frightening.
Shiraz Maher, we should also remember that despite their intense efforts, the New York Police Department did fail to find any terrorist conspiracies, budding or otherwise. Is this perhaps quite a healthy codification and confirmation of what we thought was going on anyway, and probably was going on anyway, the entire criminalization of communities since 9/11? At least it's now in the open.
Well, I think the surveillance program you talk about in New York has come under quite a lot of scrutiny and criticism, and rightly so. I don't personally feel, and I think the academic literature supports the idea, that this kind of mass surveillance doesn't really yield any positive results, and in many factors actually can be quite counterproductive by stigmatizing entire communities and making them feel under siege. That not only helps radicals who do want to create a divisive subculture, but of course it also makes individuals at a personal level much less willing to trust the state.
Will Potter, there appears to be an evolving attitude of law enforcement's role in the U.S., and it's not limited to potential Islamic extremism. There needs to be a detection of pre-crimes. There needs to be a presumption of guilt, of potential terrorism, and therefore, we need these tactics. Do you think that's based on real fear, a sense that this is going to work, or is it as base as simply, well, this is a great route to promotion within the FBI?
I think it's more of the latter. I mean, we've seen the evolution of these counterterrorism policies really since the 1980s, and what began as a corporate-initiated PR campaign has now worked its ways to the top levels of government. And I think a lot of it is just it's taking on a life of its own. In that 10 years or more since September 11th, all these policies have become unquestioned, and they've been seen as a route to career advancement and development, and also a way for the government to proclaim victories in the war on terrorism.
And of course, now we have the NSA that says it needs vast databases of all our communications because one of us is bound to be a terrorist. Isn't that philosophical? Doesn't that seem like a philosophical position, though, Will?
Absolutely. I mean, in addition to the civil liberties concerns, we should be questioning the public safety ramifications of all of this. When everyone is wrapped up in this dragnet, when everyone is considered a potential terrorism threat, it means that no one is. We're diverting law enforcement resources against nonviolent protesters, against political activists, against entire Muslim communities, rather than narrowly focusing efforts on people that might legitimately be a public safety threat.
And we'll develop some of those thoughts later in the program. First of all, though, Professor Nielsen, does terrorism have an actual academic definition, or is it a pretty meaningless term, really?
Well, the legal definitions vary. The FBI agrees that there's no consistent definition, but generally we think of it as a set of practices that are violent, that target non-state actors. It's typically accomplished by non-state actors, right? So if September 11th had been accomplished by some nation, we would call that war. And if somebody sets a bomb and they're just an American citizen and they blow up the Boston Marathon, that can, if there's no political purpose involved, then that's just murder and activating a bomb in a public place and all the other crimes that is. But there's no real consistent definition. And I would just add that when everyone's caught up in this idea of terror, this dragnet of terrorism, your other guest was saying no one's caught up, but it's also that people of color and people of certain religions are caught up in it. So it's not that everyone is being blanketly surveilled, but the attention and effort is being targeted on people based on their race and religion.
All right,
and
but
that's the real problem.
Professor Nielsen, I mean, so there is a need for violence and being a non-state actor. Is there a need to be targeting civilians for this, some sort of socio-political motivation?
Some definitions of terrorism do explicitly say that the targets need to be innocents, right? So the idea is that anyone in society could possibly be a target. That's what's terrorizing about it.
Right. I mean, what's interesting is we had an interesting ruling from a British court recently. UK authorities used the Terrorism Act to detain David Miranda. He's the partner of journalist Glenn Greenwald, who's been reporting on the NSA surveillance programs. To do that, they had to issue what's called a port circular notice. I just want to read you part of how his detention was justified under the Terrorism Act. It said, quote, "The disclosure or threat of disclosure is designed to influence a government and is made for the purpose of promoting a political or ideological cause. This, therefore, falls within the definition of terrorism. And as such, we request that the subject is examined under Schedule 7. Professor Nielsen, again there, then, any idea of violence is completely divorced from the idea of terrorism there. This is about information as terror.
Right, and that seems to be clearly the kind of state overreach of the use of the term terror in order to silence or squash political opponents. That seems like a classic example. And we've seen so many of them, you know, across the globe in the United States. It happens all the time.
Yeah, actually, Will, I wanted to ask you about that. In the US, clearly this idea of information as terror is taking hold, perhaps most clearly with the ag-gag bills. Perhaps you can explain what they are and what's driving this sort of legislation.
There's been a wave of legislation introduced across the United States that specifically targets not violence or even property destruction, but people who are taking photographs of animal cruelty on factory farms. In many cases, these photographs and video have actually led to criminal charges, but the government is going after the people who are doing the investigations. And this is all being pushed by the industries that are being exposed. In some cases, these investigators are facing penalties that are even worse than the people doing the abuse. In addition to that, they're being referred to as terrorists in state houses across the country, which to me is just a radical expansion of this rhetoric beyond terms that I would have expected even 10, 15 years ago.
And that's what's interesting as well, Will, given that it's not rather Islamic extremism that's the #1 domestic threat or terrorism threat, according to the FBI. It's environmental activists, it's animal activists. In fact, you yourself were threatened with being labeled a domestic terrorist, weren't you?
And that's in a lot of ways how I became really immersed in these issues. I had my own experiences being threatened by the FBI to be put on a domestic terrorist list. And to be clear, I mean, my experience is really pale in comparison to what Muslim communities have been experienced for years since September 11th and what many other activists have experienced. But I think it reflects just the scope of what we're talking about
right, but
today.
what have you done, though?
And how far this term has gone. I had been leafleting with a local organization. We were hanging door knockers on people's doors about animal testing. And we were arrested, and the charges were all thrown out of court, obviously, because we can still pass out leaflets in this country. But a few weeks later, I was visited by those FBI agents.
So it's not about necessarily locking you up, it's about creating a climate?
Absolutely. I think central to this discussion has to be fear. I mean, the concept of terrorism, I think, is rooted in that. That's the power of reckless and unpredictable violence, is the fear it causes. But that's also the power of this legislation that we're seeing across the country. It's making people afraid of using their rights. It's having what lawyers would call a chilling effect on constitutional activity.
And just before I bring Shiraz back into it, very quickly, and at the risk of adding to that fear, can you explain what CMUs are, which perhaps add into this idea of information as terror? The use of a special sort of prison, communications management units for those who are accused of terrorism in the US.
Communication management units are specialized prison units that have been created within the prison system in the United States. And most people have heard of Guantanamo Bay, but I don't think most people have heard about CMUs, which were created for so-called domestic terrorists and people that the government says have inspirational significance. Now, these aren't the Zacarias Moussawis or 9/11 hijackers of the world. These are people that are primarily there for nonviolent crimes because of their political ideology, and they have their rights radically restricted compared to other prisoners, and also they're separated from their communities, which is part of the entire purpose of these facilities, to make people afraid.
Shiraz Mahadan, you're an expert in radicalization and terrorism and so on. You've written articles calling for a crackdown on Salafist preachers in the UK. You've beseeched President Obama not to curtail the war on terror because of the threat that Islamic extremism continues to pose. So help us understand, where is this line between a dissident and a terrorist?
Well, I think we need to separate out a few issues very carefully here. One of the big debates post 9/11 has been about what is radicalization, and is it a state, is it a binary position into which one enters, or is it a spectrum? And I think that latter point has largely won the day. So there's a sort of broad consensus here now, emerging at least, that it's a journey on which people travel. They move from a position of sort of being a normative member of society to being one that you would label as of an extremist. Now, when you take that position, then you need to understand that there are points along that spectrum at which the state would probably want to intervene and points at which it should intervene. And one of the great difficulties for Western governments has been actually in getting that balance right. Some of the abuses that you've been mentioning are clearly appalling, and the case that Will mentions, for example, handing out leaflets, is clearly a ridiculous proposition for the state to be arresting people, to be intimidating them, or just even to be creating a climate of intimidation is clearly outrageous by any measure. So the governments have got it wrong in terms of understanding where along that spectrum they should be intervening. For a long time they intervened much too late, and they allowed far too much of a radical culture, particularly in Britain, and that's where my expertise really lies in terms of the prevent strategy, how you disrupt the chain of extremism that leads into violent extremism. But clearly you can't intervene so early into that spectrum where you then are at the risk of curtailing legitimate expression, legitimate activism, which we cherish in a free society and a democracy.
Right, but if you're talking about this journey, what point should they intervene then? When is it a pre-crime? Or do you have to wait for a crime? Or, what's your position on that?
No, I don't think well, again, we need to get away from the idea of criminalizing everyone. Clearly, there are people who engage in acts of terrorism. They need to be criminalized and dealt with by the law. But programs like Prevent in this country, at least, and the United States doesn't really have a comparable program. In the United Kingdom, the Prevent program seeks to intervene using soft power mechanisms. So it would seek to, for example, in schools or universities where individuals are beginning to mix with either known radicals, beginning to mix with people who have sometimes fallen into criminality, turning up on the periphery of those kinds of groups.
Should people be arrested if they want to go to Syria to fight and potentially come back to the UK afterwards?
Well, Syria is a very, very complex and unique scenario. I think I've actually been very critical of the government's policy in terms of Syria, saying that, again, they're using blunt tools. Not everyone who gets motivated by the Syrian conflict should be criminalized. The idea of stripping people of their passports is, I think, again, a blunt measure. And there's clearly, when you look at the profile of people who go to Syria, two types of people. There are people who have been legitimately outraged by what they see as human rights abuses taking place in that country. They go for want of a better phrase, for all the right reasons. They go because they are concerned about civilian suffering. And typically they go for shorter periods of time. They go there and they do a mix of activities, which includes fighting against the regime, but it also includes humanitarian work. They return to the UK and largely, I would say largely, pose no threat. There is a second category of person who goes who has a known extremist background in the UK, who has known associations within radical networks and environments, who goes to Syria and who sees it as a finishing school, an ability to learn skills and trade craft that could potentially be very serious. They
Right.
need to be watched and obviously looked at.
But Professor Nielsen, can we trust the US or the UK government or any other government really to make that distinction given their track record of, frankly, luring people into terrorist plots?
Right. I think we need to always be suspicious when the government is trying to use the tool of terrorism to marginalize a political message. This idea of these events being along a spectrum, I think, is exactly right. And how we define what is terrorism legally is really important, because that's the backdrop under which all of this is happening. And so if you think about like Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, they were sort of loosely affiliated but radically militia-oriented people. And so you have people doing these violent acts that kill people, but there's no group for them that claims them. And so those acts are just as terrible. Those people are just as dead. That crime is just as awful. But the argument about whether, in addition to murder, we need to charge terrorism puts us in a position where the government has quite a bit of power to create this kind of chilling environment on legitimate political discussions and dissent.
Okay, so and the fact is, despite that difficulty of pinning down what terrorism is, there has been a great deal of legislation on terrorism. After the 9/11 attacks, governments around the world have passed a series of new terrorism laws giving them unprecedented power. The US Patriot Act became the template for anti-terrorism laws around the world. It was most recently used to justify the NSA's huge spying programs. In Britain, the Terrorism Act gave authorities the power to detain terror suspects for 28 days without charge. That was the law used to detain David Miranda, the partner of journalist Glenn Greenwald. Russia's parliament is working on a new bill that could increase the punishment for terrorist activities to life in prison. And at the recent Winter Olympics in Sochi, it was environmental activists being targeted in the name of anti-terror security. Saudi Arabia passed an anti-terror law in December that effectively bans any criticism of the government and the kingdom's rulers. And Egypt outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood by designating the group a terrorist organization. Will Potter, well, it's a small world after all then. The world is getting closer, but in this manner then, and it does seem like where the US leads, the rest of the world follows, or is it simply, again, a healthy codification in some of these regimes of the sort of anti-democratic actions that were going on anyway, but at least when they're all out in the open now, they're now justifiable?
It's difficult to parse out the differences between those two, I would argue. I mean, I think these tactics have certainly existed throughout history. I mean, the idea of people in power using their power to silence dissent and to quash freedom of speech is certainly nothing new. But after 9/11, we saw new opportunities for these people to push their political agendas, especially in my work seeing the influence of corporations around the world of using that terrorism rhetoric to protect their profits and protect their ideologies. But you're right, we're seeing this exported. I mean, in my work, I've found that people around the world are monitoring not just the repressive measures of the United States, but how we as citizens are responding to it, looking to us to see how we fight back against this and what hope there is for moving forward in a democratic way.
Shiraz Maher, Nelson Mandela wasn't released earlier from prison because he refused to denounce violence. The argument being that the violence of the oppressed against brutal tyranny is a basic human right. Can one express that view now without either being labeled or indeed arrested as a terrorist, do you think?
Well, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult, and certainly what you've touched upon is clearly the abuse of terrorist legislation. And I wanted to make the point, actually, when I was discussing the spectrum as well earlier and about interventions, I want to be very clear. What we want to see by this kind of emphasis on interventions along that sort of extremist spectrum is a move away from criminal prosecutions. Intervention is clearly going to be a much better cure in those scenarios. And again, actually, in large part, those interventions shouldn't be coming from the state. They should be coming from community activist organizations themselves through a program which could be state-sponsored of building capacity within local communities. So,
right, but now we know they spy on you. If you start cooperating with the police and a community organization in a Muslim community, you can't trust where that information is going or what it's going to be used for.
Well, again, I think the security service and the police forces need to really assess the utility of some of their approaches. As you mentioned, quite rightly so, many of these communities feel stigmatized. They feel under some sort of duress or under the banner of suspicion, and that makes them suspicious of the police themselves, and it creates this distrust within communities. So even well-meaning people who would otherwise want to help then feel one step removed from those agencies. So I think actually there needs to be a full audit within these agencies of the efficacy of their own programs, and they need to be much smarter about how they're engaging with people, how they're building capacity within communities.
Professor Nielsen, what about that point then about justifiable violent resistance against brutal tyranny?
Well, I think it's absolutely a human right, and I think we'll look back at this period, at least in the U.S. and maybe globally, with shame. You know, it will be like the McCarthy period. It will be like the time of the Alien and the Sedition Act. It will be like the times when we've done the Japanese internment camps, when the U.S. government, perhaps out of best wishes for keeping the country safe, has gone over the line in terms of how far they're willing to abrogate our constitutional rights in the name of safety.
Right, but Will, is it about safety then? I mean, we've talked in broad terms about corporate interests and others, but when you follow the paper trail, is this really about safety?
No, the paper trail shows this has nothing to do with safety. In fact, in my research, I found that the Inspector General of the Justice Department has actually told the FBI to stop doing this, to stop focusing on environmentalists, because it puts public safety at risk by wasting counterterrorism resources. So we need to ask ourselves, why is this continuing? And the only explanation is the disproportionate influence of corporations on every aspect of the political process. I mean, this is more about protecting corporate profits than it is about protecting public safety.
Professor Nielsen, given how obviously the term is misused then, why do you think terrorism is still, or at least the word, is still such an effective tool for government?
Because it's so frightening. I mean, that's precisely, I completely agree, Will, that what's being done in the agriculture silencing area is using the law to protect capitalism and capitalist profits against what is purely speech and occasionally very minor crimes of trespass in order to get footage, right? So they continue to use the word because when you use it, people step back and say, well, then that kind of law must be justified. That big sledgehammer of law should come in here because terrorism is frightening. And so applying it to informational campaigns about where your chicken that you're eating came from, and applying it to groups that might be planning to bomb large buildings in major cities is utterly absurd. But they use it because it works. It works to get American citizens to back off from questioning the kinds of rights that they're giving up.
As an expert in radicalization, Shiraz Maher, then, as we wrap up then, is the penny beginning to drop, though, that in fact, if this is simply about protecting the homeland, it isn't simply about protecting corporate profits when it comes to Islamic extremism, that actually it's precisely these anti-terrorist laws that are helping the radicalization and creating a threat to the homeland?
I'd say the fundamental problem lies not with necessarily the legislation, but with the manner in which it's being applied by various agencies. And it's on those agencies that pressure should be put, really, for them to assess internally, and of course with that pressure coming from outside, the efficacy of these programs, because clearly terrorism does exist, and clearly terrorism is a threat that has been present within our societies for much of the last decade, and I'm afraid to say, off the back of Syria, is something that will be with us perhaps for another generation, maybe two. It's something we do need to take seriously. What we need to consider, though, is how that's applied and how that's enforced at a state level.
Shiraz Maher, thank you very much. Professor Laura Beth Nielsen, thank you. Will Potter, thank you very much as well.